Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most hidden yet essential aspects of Roman society. The lives of those who worked in the empire's countless brothels, whose stories have been buried beneath centuries of moral judgment and historical silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together as we uncover the secret lives of Rome's most marginalized workers. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Roman brothel workers. Most people imagine them as either glamorous courtesans living lives of luxury or tragic victims with no agency whatsoever. In reality, the truth was far more complex, like imagining modern service workers exist only as either millionaire influencers or helpless slaves. This wasn't a world of clear-cut victims and villains. It was a messy, complicated economic and social reality where people navigated survival within an unforgiving system. Some were slaves, yes, but others were freedwomen running their own businesses. Some lived in squalor, while others accumulated enough wealth to own property. Some were trapped. Others chose this work over even worse alternatives. The Roman world didn't operate by all moral categories, and neither did the people trying to survive within it. The Roman Empire at its height wasn't the marble-columned fantasy we see in movies. It was a sprawling, chaotic, urban civilization, where millions of people crowded into cities that had grown far beyond their infrastructure's capacity. Rome itself wasn't a pristine imperial capital. It was an overcrowded metropolis of over 1 million souls, with apartment buildings reaching dangerous heights, narrow streets filled with waste, and a constant struggle for basic necessities. Brothels, taverns, and bathhouses controlled much of the city's social and economic life, and the lines between respectability and scandal were far blurrier than later Christian moralists would have us believe. If you thought ancient Rome was all togas in philosophy, think again. This was a society where sexual services were as regulated and taxed as any other trade. Prostitution wasn't hidden in dark alleys. It was openly practiced, legally recognized, and socially integrated into daily life. The government collected taxes on it, poets wrote about it, and even respectable citizens frequented establishments without the shame that would characterize later eras. Graffiti from Pompeii advertises services and prices as casually as modern billboards promote restaurants. This was a world where survival often meant accepting whatever opportunities were available, regardless of what later generations might think about those choices. Meet Syrtis, whose story survives in graffiti scratched into the walls of a Pompeian brothel. Syrtis, the slave of Caecius, fucked here many times with many girls. But Syrtis wasn't just any slave. He was apparently wealthy enough to be a regular customer, which reveals the strange contradictions of Roman social hierarchy. A slave could own property, run businesses, and even own other slaves, while technically remaining someone else's legal possession. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the most successful brothel operators were former slaves themselves, freedwomen who had worked their way up from the bottom of society's ladder. Take the case of Caecilia Iucunda, whose tomb inscription proudly declares that she went from slave to successful businesswoman, owning multiple properties, including what were almost certainly brothels. She wasn't ashamed of her past or her profession. She advertised it, and if you think that's surprising, wait until you hear about the religious festivals, where prostitutes were not only welcomed, but considered essential participants. The Floralia festival literally couldn't function without sex workers, who were seen as necessary for the fertility rituals that kept the empire prosperous. During these celebrations, normal social hierarchies temporarily dissolved, and women, who were illegally infamous, marked as infamous and stripped of citizen rights, became central figures in state-sponsored religious ceremonies. These weren't outcasts hiding in society's shadows. They were integral to Roman religious and social life, even as they occupied the bottom rungs of the legal hierarchy. The contradiction was stark. The same people Rome needed for its spiritual and economic health were also the ones it legally degraded and socially marginalized. This wasn't just about individual survival stories or titillating historical gossip. The lives of Roman brothel workers reveal how an entire civilization structured itself around contradictions we can barely comprehend today. Here were people who could be simultaneously essential and despised, profitable and powerless, religiously significant and legally non-existent. Understanding their world means grappling with questions that still haunt us. How do people maintain dignity within dehumanizing systems? What happens when economic necessity collides with social judgment? How do societies create the very problems they then condemn their most vulnerable members for experiencing? The answers aren't comfortable, and they don't fit neatly into modern categories of oppression and liberation. These weren't just ancient problems. They're patterns that repeat throughout history whenever societies create underclasses, all simultaneously depending on their labor. The Roman approach to regulating and taxing sex work while denying workers basic legal protections mirrors debates we're still having today about how to treat marginalized workers in essential but stigmatized industries. The scale was staggering. Historians estimate that major Roman cities had one brothel for every 75 residents, making this industry larger than most legitimate trades. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers across the empire, each with their own story of survival, ambition, exploitation, and resilience. Their experiences shaped Roman law, influenced imperial policy, and left traces in everything, from poetry to tombstone inscriptions. To ignore their stories is to miss a fundamental piece of how the ancient world actually worked, as opposed to how we wish it had worked. But individual stories like Syrtis and Caecilia were just the beginning of a much larger and more complex system. To understand how hundreds of thousands of people navigated this world, we need to examine the economic forces that created and sustained the Roman sex trade across centuries of imperial expansion and urban growth. The economic machinery that powered Rome's sex trade wasn't some underground black market. It was a fully integrated part of the imperial tax system, as regulated and documented as grain imports or military contracts. Unlike our modern assumptions about prostitution existing in legal gray areas, Roman brothels operated under a complex web of licenses, taxes, and municipal regulations that treated sexual services like any other urban business. The state didn't just tolerate this industry. It actively profited from it, creating a bureaucratic framework that simultaneously legitimized and stigmatized the workers within it. This developed because Rome was, above all else, a practical empire. When you're managing a territory stretching from Britain to Syria, with cities growing faster than anyone can plan for them, moral idealism takes a backseat to economic necessity. The imperial government needed revenue streams, and they found them wherever people were willing to pay. Brothels generated substantial tax income, provided employment for thousands, and served what Romans considered a basic social need, much like bathhouses or taverns. But here's where Roman pragmatism created its own contradictions. The same legal system that taxed brothel income also stripped sex workers of basic citizenship rights. The same society that integrated prostitution into religious festivals also marked anyone who worked in the industry as infamous, legally infamous, permanently excluded from respectability. Workers could earn money, own property, even achieve wealth, but they could never escape the legal and social consequences of their profession. It was economic integration paired with systematic social degradation, a combination that reveals how Rome managed to be both remarkably tolerant and deeply discriminatory at the same time. Take the case of the Lupanar of Pompeii, the most famous surviving Roman brothel, whose walls still bear the evidence of this regulated industry. The building wasn't hidden away in some seedy back alley. It sat right in the city center, marked with explicit frescoes that served as both advertisement and price list. Archaeological evidence shows it operated under official licenses, paid regular taxes, and followed municipal building codes. The rooms were small but professionally constructed, with stone beds and proper drainage systems. Each room had a stone masonry bed with a mattress, and the walls were decorated with erotic paintings that functioned as a menu of available services. This wasn't a desperate underground operation. It was legitimate urban infrastructure, as regulated as any bakery or tavern. This underground society wasn't just about survival, though survival was certainly part of it. These communities created their own forms of respectability, their own measures of success, and their own ways of protecting vulnerable members. They had internal codes of conduct, systems for sharing information about dangerous customers, networks for lending money and resources, and even their own forms of religious practice that gave meaning and dignity to work that the broader society simultaneously needed and despised. What's remarkable is how sophisticated these parallel social structures became. Workers developed their own slang and communication systems, created informal apprenticeship programs for newcomers, established rotating credit associations that allowed members to accumulate capital, and maintained extensive intelligence networks about clients, competitors, and legal developments. They formed business partnerships, romantic relationships, and chosen families that provided emotional support in a world designed to isolate them. This social ecosystem extended far beyond the workers themselves. It included sympathetic tavern keepers, clothing vendors who specialized in their needs, scribes who helped with contracts and correspondence, religious figures who provided spiritual guidance, and even some wealthy patrons who became genuine protectors rather than mere customers. These relationships created a shadow economy and shadow society that allowed people to maintain dignity and build meaningful lives despite their official status, as in FAM is. Understanding this world requires looking beyond the legal documents and tax records to examine the graffiti, personal letters, religious dedications, and tomb inscriptions that reveal how these communities actually functioned on a daily basis. Consider the story of Prima, whose life we can reconstruct from multiple sources found in Pompeii. She appears in at least 7 different graffiti inscriptions, not as a passive subject, but as an active participant in a complex social network. One inscription reads, "Prima loves Actuarius," suggesting a romantic relationship with someone whose name indicates he was a public clerk, possibly someone with access to useful information about legal matters or business licenses. Another graffito shows her lending money to a fellow worker. Prima gave Secunda 5 denarii on the Ides of Julius. But the most revealing inscription is a longer text that appears to be Prima's own advertisement for her services, written in unusually sophisticated Latin that suggests she was literate and educated. Prima offers companionship for discerning gentlemen, skilled in conversation and the arts of Venus, available by appointment through Gaius the doorkeeper. This wasn't just advertising sex. It was positioning herself as a cultured companion for wealthy clients who valued intelligence and social skills alongside physical services. The archaeological evidence from Prima's probable workplace tells us even more. The room associated with her name contained high-quality oil lamps, imported pottery, jewelry, and even writing materials, suggesting she maintained a standard of living well above survival level. More importantly, the room showed evidence of multiple occupants over time, indicating she may have been training or mentoring newer workers. passing on both practical skills and social connections. The network around Prima extended throughout Pompeii's entertainment district. Graffiti shows her connected to Crescens, who appears to have been a successful male sex worker, serving both male and female clients. To Fortunata, who operated what seems to have been an upscale establishment, specializing in dinner parties with entertainment. And to several people whose names appear in business contexts throughout the city. This wasn't an isolated individual struggling alone. It was someone embedded in a sophisticated social and economic network. Even more fascinating is the case of the women of the suburb baths in Pompeii, where recent archaeological work has revealed evidence of an organized collective that seems to have operated both bathing facilities and sexual services. The women's names appear together in multiple inscriptions, always in the same order, suggesting a formal hierarchy or partnership structure. Business records, scratched into the walls, show they shared expenses for supplies, coordinated their schedules to maximize coverage, and maintained a common fund for emergencies or investments. One inscription reads, "The women of the baths pooled 50 denarii for the festival of Venus." This reveals several important things. They had enough disposable income to make substantial religious donations. They organized themselves as a formal group for financial purposes, and they maintained relationships with religious institutions despite their legal status as infamous. Another inscription shows them collectively hiring a scribe to draft what appears to be a business contract, indicating they conducted their affairs with the same professionalism as any other trade association. The most extraordinary case comes from legal papyri found in Egypt, detailing the business empire of a woman named Apollodora, who started as a brothel worker and eventually owned a network of establishments across 3 cities. Her surviving correspondence reveals a sophisticated understanding of Roman commercial law, extensive relationships with ship captains and merchants, and detailed knowledge of market conditions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. But what makes Apollodora's story remarkable isn't just her business success. It's how she used her wealth and connections to create opportunities for other women in similar situations. Her letters reference loans she made to help workers buy their freedom, partnerships she formed with women starting their own establishments, and a kind of informal apprenticeship program where she trained promising individuals in business management, alongside the more obvious skills of their trade. One letter discusses her negotiations with a wealthy Roman matron who wanted to secretly invest in Apollodora's operations. The correspondence reveals that respectable Roman women sometimes provided capital for sex work businesses, creating financial partnerships that benefited both parties while maintaining the legal fiction that distinguished respectable investors from infamous workers. These arrangements show how the parallel economy created by sex workers began to intersect with and influence the broader Roman financial system. This wasn't isolated to a few exceptional individuals. Similar patterns appear throughout the Roman world wherever we have sufficient archaeological and documentary evidence. Workers consistently organized themselves into mutual support networks that provided both practical assistance and social connection. They developed internal hierarchies based on earning power, client relationships, and business acumen rather than traditional Roman social markers, like family background or citizen status. These communities created their own forms of social mobility that operated independently of the legal restrictions placed on them. A successful worker could gain respect and influence within her community regardless of her official infamous status. She could mentor newcomers, form business partnerships, accumulate property, and even achieve a form of local celebrity that transcended her legal limitations. The pattern extended to religious life as well. While mainstream Roman religious institutions often excluded sex workers from full participation, these communities developed their own relationships with deities like Venus, Priapus, and various fertility goddesses. They made donations to temples, commissioned religious artwork, and even sponsored public festivals, using wealth generated by stigmatized work to participate in the spiritual life of their cities. Perhaps most importantly, these networks provided protection in ways the legal system couldn't or wouldn't. Workers shared information about violent or dishonest customers, coordinated responses to legal threats, pooled resources to handle medical emergencies, and created informal systems of justice for dealing with disputes within their communities. They negotiated collectively with building owners for better working conditions, with local officials for fair treatment under regulations, and even with criminal gangs for protection from exploitation. The economic patterns were equally sophisticated. Workers developed rotating credit associations similar to those found in many traditional societies, allowing members to accumulate capital for major purchases or investments. They formed business partnerships that distributed both risk and profit across multiple establishments. They created informal banks that provided loans to other marginalized groups who couldn't access traditional Roman financial institutions. These communities also pioneered business practices that were later adopted by more respectable industries. They developed standardized pricing, quality control measures, customer service protocols, and marketing strategies that influenced how Romans thought about commercial services in general. The customer review system visible in Pompeian graffiti may represent one of the earliest examples of formal consumer feedback mechanisms in Roman commerce. The effects of these parallel social structures extended far beyond the sex work industry itself. These communities became laboratories for alternative forms of social organization that challenged Roman assumptions about hierarchy, respectability, and economic relationships. They demonstrated that people officially excluded from civic life could create their own forms of governance, mutual aid, and collective action. The economic impact was substantial. The wealth generated by organized sex work flowed into legitimate businesses throughout Roman cities. Workers were major customers for clothing vendors, jewelry makers, cosmetics producers, wine merchants, and food suppliers. Their demand for luxury goods helped sustain entire industries. Their investments in property development contributed to urban growth. More subtly, these communities influenced Roman culture in ways that are still visible in surviving art, literature, and legal documents. The frank discussion of sexuality that characterizes much Roman poetry and prose was partly shaped by the normalization of commercial sex work. The sophisticated understanding of economic relationships that appears in Roman commercial law reflects innovations first developed in the sex trade. The social innovations developed by sex worker communities also influenced broader Roman approaches to marginalized populations. The mutual aid networks, rotating credit systems, and collective bargaining strategies created by sex workers were eventually adopted by other stigmatized groups, including actors, gladiators, and foreign merchants. These models provided alternatives to traditional Roman patronage relationships. Perhaps most significantly, these communities preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Many sex workers were educated slaves, or freed women from Greek-speaking areas who maintained literacy and cultural sophistication despite their illegal status. They served as informal teachers, scribes, and cultural interpreters throughout the Roman world. Yet even as these remarkable communities created their own forms of social organization and economic success, they remained vulnerable to the broader political and social forces that shaped Roman society. The tolerance that allowed these parallel structures to flourish was always conditional, always subject to change based on political calculations, moral panics, or economic pressures that had nothing to do with the communities themselves. The rise of Christianity, shifts in imperial policy, economic disruptions, and changing urban demographics all pose threats to the delicate balance these communities had achieved. Their success in creating alternative forms of social organization made them visible, and visibility could be dangerous for people whose legal status depended on remaining marginal and unthreatening to established power structures. To understand how these communities navigated the political challenges that threatened their existence, we need to examine the dramatic conflicts that periodically erupted between the parallel world of Roman sex work and official structures of imperial authority. These clashes reveal the tensions inherent in a system that simultaneously depended on and despised an entire category of workers, and they show how political events could suddenly transform the carefully negotiated arrangements that allowed these communities to survive and thrive within an unforgiving social system. By the reign of Emperor Tiberius in 19 CE, the carefully balanced world of Roman sex work had reached a breaking point that would expose the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the empire's approach to its most marginalized workers. What started as a routine Senate debate about moral legislation would escalate into a full-scale political crisis that revealed just how dependent Roman society had become on the very people it legally despised. The trigger was seemingly minor: a proposal by conservative senators to tighten restrictions on who could work in brothels, specifically targeting women from respectable families who had entered sex work. But this wasn't really about protecting aristocratic honor. It was about a power struggle between different factions of the Roman elite, with sex workers caught in the middle of forces far beyond their control. The stakes involved weren't just legal technicalities. By this point, the sex trade had become so economically integrated into Roman urban life that major disruptions threatened entire neighborhoods. Brothel districts employed thousands of people beyond just the workers themselves: doorkeepers, wine sellers, clothing merchants, scribes, security personnel, and countless others whose livelihoods depended on the industry's continued operation. The tax revenue generated by licensed establishments had become essential to municipal budgets across the empire. More dangerous still, the sophisticated social networks that sex workers had built over generations meant they possessed detailed knowledge about the private lives of Rome's most powerful citizens. They knew which senators frequented which establishments, which policies were debated in private conversations after business hours, and which officials were vulnerable to blackmail or political pressure. In a society where reputation and status meant everything, the people with the least official power potentially held the most dangerous secrets. The key players involved in this crisis read like a who's who of Roman politics. Emperor Tiberius himself was known to frequent brothels and maintain relationships with several high-end courtesans, making his position particularly delicate. Conservative senators like Marcus Silanus saw an opportunity to score political points by advocating for traditional values, while liberals like Gaius Asinius Pollio warned that harsh crackdowns would drive the industry underground and make it far more dangerous for everyone involved. The crisis exploded into public view when Caecilia, a woman from one of Rome's most distinguished patrician families, publicly registered herself as a prostitute to escape the legal restrictions that governed aristocratic women's behavior. Under Roman law, upper-class women couldn't divorce easily, couldn't control their own property, and faced severe penalties for adultery. But sex workers, despite their infamous status, had more freedom to conduct business, travel independently, and control their own bodies. Caecilia's registration wasn't just a personal rebellion. It was a calculated political statement that exposed the absurdity of a legal system that gave prostitutes more practical autonomy than respectable wives. Word of her actions spread through Rome's social networks like wildfire, and within days, dozens of other aristocratic women had followed her example. Names like Claudia Pulchra and Aemilia Lepida appeared on the prostitute registries alongside their family lineages, creating a scandal that reached the highest levels of Roman society. The conservative establishment was horrified. If respectable women could simply declare themselves prostitutes to escape traditional restrictions, the entire social hierarchy was at risk. The Senate's response was swift and brutal. Senator Marcus Silanus proposed legislation that would not only ban women of senatorial rank from registering as prostitutes, but would retroactively punish those who had already done so. The proposed penalties were severe: exile, property confiscation, and permanent disgrace for the women and their families. But the legislation went further, calling for a comprehensive crackdown on the entire sex trade, including new restrictions on licensing, higher taxes, expanded police powers to shut down establishments deemed threats to public morality, and even provisions for demolishing brothel districts entirely. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn, because the sex worker communities that had spent generations building networks of mutual support and political intelligence suddenly found themselves with unprecedented leverage. They knew which senators were secretly clients, which officials had financial interests in brothel properties, and which politicians had made promises they couldn't afford to have exposed. More importantly, they had the organizational capacity to coordinate a response across multiple cities simultaneously, using the same networks that had previously been used for business, coordination, and mutual protection. The counterattack began subtly. Graffiti appeared throughout Rome, listing the names of senators alongside their preferred sexual services and how much they paid. Marcus Crassus likes Greek boys and pays triple rates appeared on walls near the Forum. Senator Lucius owes Prima 200 denarii for services rendered during the Saturnalia festival showed up near the Curia. Silanus himself frequents the Egyptian house every Ides, appeared directly outside his own residence. These weren't random insults. They were targeted intelligence operations designed to create maximum political embarrassment while demonstrating the depth of information these communities possessed. But the sex workers didn't stop at public shaming. Coordinated through the networks that had developed over decades, workers across the empire began what we might recognize today as a general strike. Brothels closed their doors, independent operators refused new clients, and even high-end courtesans suddenly became unavailable to their wealthy patrons. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Tax revenues plummeted, entertainment districts emptied, and thousands of secondary businesses found themselves without customers overnight. More dramatically, several prominent politicians found themselves facing blackmail on an unprecedented scale. Apollodora, the businesswoman whose empire we encountered earlier, apparently had detailed records of client preferences, payment histories, and private conversations spanning decades. Her surviving correspondence suggests she coordinated with other operators to present certain senators with a choice: withdraw support for the harsh crackdown legislation, or face public exposure of their most embarrassing secrets, complete with dates, witnesses, and financial records. The climax came during a Senate session where Marcus Silanus was presenting his final arguments for the anti-prostitution legislation. According to the historian Tacitus, a group of sex workers actually entered the Senate building, somehow bypassing all security, and began reading aloud from scrolls that appeared to contain detailed accounts of various senators' private activities. The chaos that followed was apparently so complete that the session had to be suspended, with several senators fleeing the building in panic while others shouted contradictory orders to guards who seemed unsure whether to arrest the women or protect the senators from further embarrassment. Emperor Tiberius, caught between conservative allies demanding moral crackdowns and the practical necessity of maintaining urban stability, initially tried to find a middle ground. He issued public proclamations supporting traditional family values, while privately negotiating with brothel operators to ensure continued service to important clients. But this satisfied no one and only made the crisis worse, creating the impression of imperial weakness and indecision. The breaking point came when it became clear that the sex worker networks had allies throughout Roman society that went far beyond their immediate communities. Tavern keepers, wine merchants, cloth dealers, and countless other businesses that depended on brothel districts joined the economic boycotts. More surprising, several prominent Roman matrons publicly supported the striking workers, arguing that the proposed legislation was really an attack on women's economic autonomy in general and represented government overreach into private, commercial arrangements. The response was swift and revealed the true power dynamics underlying Roman society. Within a week of the Senate disruption, Emperor Tiberius abandoned all pretense of neutrality and sided decisively with the status quo. Marcus Silanus found himself suddenly stripped of political support, his legislation withdrawn, and his career effectively ended. The conservative crackdown that had seemed inevitable just days earlier collapsed completely. But the victory came at a cost that would reshape the sex trade for generations. While the immediate crisis had been averted, the confrontation had made visible just how much political and economic power these supposedly marginalized communities actually wielded. This visibility made them targets for future crackdowns and forced them to develop even more sophisticated methods of protecting themselves. The immediate economic consequences were substantial. The brief strike had demonstrated just how integrated sex work was into Roman urban life, leading to increased official recognition and more favorable regulations. Tax rates were actually reduced in some cities, licensing became more accessible, and workers gained new legal protections against arbitrary harassment. The industry emerged from the crisis stronger and more legitimized than before. Politically, the crisis established precedents that would influence Roman governance for centuries. It became clear that any major policy changes affecting sex work required careful negotiation with industry representatives rather than simple top-down mandates. The networks that had coordinated the resistance became permanent, lobbying organizations that maintained ongoing relationships with political officials. The social fallout was equally significant. The crisis had forced Roman society to confront the contradictions in its treatment of sex workers, leading to a period of greater tolerance and integration. Workers who had previously operated in social isolation found themselves with unexpected allies among merchants, politicians, and even respectable matrons who had witnessed their organizational capacity and political sophistication. Most importantly, the crisis demonstrated that people officially excluded from political participation could still exercise significant political power through economic coordination and information control. The networks of mutual support that sex workers had built over generations proved capable of challenging the Roman state itself when their survival was threatened. The international implications were also substantial. News of the crisis spread throughout the Roman world, inspiring similar organizational efforts by marginalized communities in other provinces. The tactics developed during the Roman confrontation, coordinated economic action, strategic information releases, and alliance building with other affected groups, became models for political resistance that influenced social movements across the Mediterranean. This confrontation wasn't just a colorful historical anecdote about ancient Roman politics. It revealed fundamental truths about how societies manage essential but stigmatized labor that remain relevant today. The crisis showed how economic integration and social marginalization could coexist, creating unstable arrangements that periodically exploded into political conflict. The Roman approach to sex work, legal regulation combined with social stigmatization, created communities that were simultaneously powerless and powerful, visible and invisible, essential and disposable. These contradictions generated tensions that could remain dormant for generations before suddenly erupting into major political crises that threatened the stability of the entire system. What the crisis revealed most clearly was that marginalized communities often develop forms of power that operate outside official political channels, but can be just as effective as traditional political influence. The information networks, economic coordination, and social alliances that sex workers had built over decades proved capable of challenging imperial policy when their survival was at stake. The precedent established during this crisis that stigmatized but economically essential workers could successfully resist political persecution through coordinated action would be remembered and applied by other marginalized groups throughout Roman history. Gladiators, actors, foreign merchants, and even some slave communities would later use similar tactics when facing systematic oppression. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis demonstrated that Roman pragmatism ultimately trumped Roman moralism when the two came into direct conflict. Despite all the rhetoric about traditional values and public morality, the empire's practical needs for tax revenue, urban stability, and social order took precedence over conservative moral agendas. This established a pattern that would characterize Roman policy toward marginal communities for centuries to come. Around the central drama of Roman sex work, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that revealed just how deeply this industry was woven into the fabric of ancient society. These weren't peripheral figures. They were essential players whose stories illuminate the complex web of relationships that made the entire system function. Marcus Caecilius, known as the doorkeeper of Rome, appears in graffiti and legal documents from at least 12 different brothels across the city. But Marcus wasn't just any doorkeeper. He was apparently an information broker who maintained detailed knowledge about which clients visited which establishments, what services they preferred, and how much they were willing to pay. His surviving account books, discovered in a Pompeian archive, revealed that he earned more than many skilled craftsmen by selling information to competitors, helping clients find specific services, and even arranging discreet meetings for high-profile customers who couldn't be seen entering brothels directly. Marcus developed what we might recognize today as the world's first escort referral service. Wealthy clients would send messages to him specifying their preferences: a tall Greek woman who speaks philosophy, or someone who resembles my wife but younger, and he would arrange introductions while taking a commission from both parties. His network extended throughout the Mediterranean, with correspondence showing he arranged services for Roman officials visiting distant provinces and helped traveling sex workers find employment in new cities. Then there's Claudia Acta, a freedwoman who never worked as a sex worker herself, but became one of the most powerful figures in the industry through her role as a moneylender and property manager. Acta specialized in providing capital to workers who wanted to buy their freedom, establish their own businesses, or invest in real estate. Her contracts, preserved in Egyptian papyri, show she charged reasonable interest rates and rarely foreclosed on borrowers, suggesting she understood that her long-term profits depended on the success of her clients. But Acta's most interesting innovation was creating what appears to be the first worker protection insurance system. For a small monthly fee, workers could join her mutual aid society, which provided medical care during illness, legal representation during disputes, and even funeral expenses. Her records show she maintained a staff of doctors, lawyers, and scribes specifically to serve the sex work community, creating a parallel support system that operated independently of mainstream Roman institutions. Perhaps most remarkable was Gaius Petronius Arbiter, a Roman knight who became the unofficial chronicler of brothel culture. Petronius frequented establishments not just as a customer, but as a social observer, recording conversations, documenting business practices, and preserving the stories that workers told about their lives. His notebooks, partially preserved in later literary works, provide some of our most detailed insights into the daily reality of Roman sex work. Petronius, saw himself as an anthropologist of the margins, fascinated by how these communities created their own forms of art, music, and storytelling. He documented drinking songs that workers had composed, recorded jokes and stories that circulated within brothel networks, and even preserved examples of worker slang that would otherwise have been lost to history. His work reveals that these communities had rich cultural lives that extended far beyond their economic functions. Among the most influential supporting characters were the religious figures who served these communities. Prisca, a priestess of Venus, operated what was essentially a temple brothel where sexual services were provided as part of religious rituals. But Prisca also served as a counselor, mediator, and spiritual advisor to workers throughout Rome. Her temple became a sanctuary where disputes could be resolved, business partnerships could be formed, and workers could find emotional support during difficult periods. Prisca developed elaborate religious ceremonies that gave dignity and meaning to sex work, positioning it as sacred service to the goddess of love rather than merely commercial. Transaction. Her rituals included purification ceremonies for new workers, blessing ceremonies for those leaving the profession, and seasonal festivals that celebrated sexuality as a positive force in human life. These religious frameworks provided psychological resources that helped workers maintain self-respect within a society that officially stigmatized them. The male sex workers who served both male and female clients represent another crucial group of supporting characters. Crescens, whose name appears frequently in Pompeian graffiti, seems to have been particularly successful at navigating the complex social dynamics involved in serving clients from different social classes and genders. His story reveals how male sex workers faced different challenges than their female counterparts. They had more legal rights, but also faced different forms of social stigma, particularly when serving male clients in a society that valued masculine dominance. These weren't isolated individuals operating independently. Their stories intersect in ways that reveal the sophisticated social networks underlying Roman sex work. The relationships between Marcus the doorkeeper, Claudia Acta the moneylender, and Prisca the priestess created a support ecosystem that served hundreds of workers across multiple cities. Consider how their services complemented each other. Marcus would refer new workers to Acta for startup loans, while Acta would direct her clients to Prisca for spiritual guidance and community integration. Prisca's temple served as neutral ground where business disputes could be resolved, while Marcus's information networks helped enforce agreements and punish those who violated community norms. Together, they created an informal but highly effective governance system for an industry that existed largely outside official Roman institutions. The interconnections extended across social boundaries in surprising ways. Petronius's notebooks revealed that several respectable Roman matrons secretly invested in Acta's lending operations, providing capital that allowed her to expand her services while giving wealthy women access to profitable investments they couldn't make through traditional channels. These partnerships were carefully concealed but mutually beneficial, showing how the sex work economy intersected with mainstream Roman finance in ways that would have shocked contemporary moralists. Even more intriguing are the family connections that emerge from careful analysis of surviving records. Marcus the doorkeeper was apparently the freed slave of a senator who remained his secret business partner, using his political connections to protect the doorkeeper's operations while sharing in the profits. Acta's own freedom had been purchased with funds provided by 3 of her future clients, creating ongoing relationships that blurred the lines between financial obligation, personal loyalty, and romantic attachment. The religious network centered around Prisca connected to similar operations throughout the Roman world. Her correspondence with other Venus priestesses reveals a communication system that shared information about dangerous clients, profitable opportunities, and legal developments. Across the Mediterranean, When workers traveled between cities, they carried letters of introduction that ensured them access to local support networks and spiritual communities. Perhaps most fascinating are the multi-generational relationships that developed within these networks. Workers who achieved financial success often became mentors to newcomers, passing on not just practical skills but also social connections and business relationships. Acta's lending records show her providing favorable terms to the daughters and sons of previous clients, creating inherited relationships that lasted across decades. These interconnections also created their own forms of social mobility that operated parallel to traditional Roman advancement systems. Successful workers could become moneylenders, property managers, or religious leaders within their communities, achieving forms of respect and influence that were denied to them in mainstream society. The networks provided alternative pathways to prosperity and status that allowed exceptional individuals to transcend their official legal limitations. The business partnerships that emerged from these relationships were remarkably sophisticated. Marcus's referral service connected with Acta's financial operations to create what amounted to franchise arrangements, where experienced workers could establish operations in new cities with guaranteed access to capital, information networks, and established client bases. These partnerships spread successful business models throughout the Roman world while maintaining quality, control, and mutual support systems. The criminal justice aspects of these networks were equally complex. When workers were victims of violence or fraud, the community networks provided both practical assistance and informal justice. Marcus's information systems could identify and punish dangerous clients, while Acta's financial networks could provide economic pressure against those who refused to honor agreements. These interconnected stories revealed that Roman sex work operated as a shadow society with its own economic institutions, religious practices, social hierarchies, and justice systems. The supporting characters weren't peripheral figures, but essential infrastructure that allowed the entire system to function despite official hostility and legal marginalization. To understand how these networks could develop and flourish, we need to grasp the broader cultural context that made such arrangements both necessary and possible. Roman society in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was undergoing rapid urbanization that created both opportunities and challenges for people living on society's margins. Traditional Roman social structures were designed for small agricultural communities where everyone knew everyone else and social relationships were governed by well-established customs. But the massive cities of the imperial period brought together people from different cultures, backgrounds, and legal statuses in ways that overwhelmed traditional social controls. This created space for alternative forms of social organization to develop. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Antioch, with populations in the hundreds of thousands, it was possible to create parallel social worlds that operated with considerable independence from mainstream society. The cultural diversity of Roman cities also contributed to the complexity of these networks. Workers included Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Germans, and people from throughout the known world, each bringing different cultural approaches to sexuality, business, and social organization. The resulting synthesis created practices and institutions that were more sophisticated and flexible than any single cultural tradition might have produced. Roman legal pragmatism also played a crucial role. While the law officially stigmatized sex workers, it also recognized their economic functions and provided frameworks for taxation, property ownership, and business operations that allowed these communities to accumulate wealth and develop institutional structures. The religious tolerance that characterized much of Roman culture provided another crucial element. The empire's openness to foreign religions and mystery cults created space for alternative spiritual practices that served these communities. Priestesses like Prisca could operate with considerable freedom as long as they didn't directly challenge Roman political authority. Perhaps most ironic was how the Roman system created situations where officially despised sex workers possessed more practical autonomy and economic opportunity than many respectable citizens. While aristocratic women faced severe legal restrictions on their ability to own property, conduct business, or travel independently, successful sex workers like Octa could accumulate substantial wealth, operate complex business enterprises, and maintain extensive international networks. The contradiction was even starker for men. Marcus, the doorkeeper, despite his association with a stigmatized industry, wielded more practical influence over Roman social and political life than many citizens who possessed formal political rights, but lacked his information networks and economic resources. The religious contradictions were equally profound. Priestesses like Prisca provided spiritual guidance and religious services that were highly valued by their communities, yet they were excluded from mainstream religious institutions because of their association with sex work. They created rich, spiritual lives and meaningful religious practices, while being officially condemned by the very religious traditions they adapted and served. These contradictions weren't accidental, they were the inevitable result of a system that tried to simultaneously exploit and stigmatize the same people. Roman society needed the services, tax revenue, and economic activity that sex workers provided, but it also needed to maintain social hierarchies that designated some people as inferior. The result was a complex web of legal, social, and economic relationships that satisfied neither moral consistency nor practical efficiency, but somehow managed to function for centuries through the creative adaptations of people like Marcus, Acta Prisca, and countless others whose names have been lost to history. Everything changed when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE with the Edict of Milan, setting in motion a transformation that would fundamentally alter the world Roman sex workers had spent centuries building. This wasn't just another political shift or administrative reform. It was the beginning of a moral revolution that would challenge the very foundations of Roman pragmatism towards sexuality. And commerce thought the change didn't happen overnight, but the signs were unmistakable to those who knew how to read them. Christian bishops began appearing at imperial councils, their voices carrying weight in policy discussions that had previously been dominated by traditional Roman pragmatism. Municipal officials who had routinely renewed brothel licenses started asking uncomfortable questions about the moral implications of their decisions. Tax collectors who had efficiently processed revenues from sex work began expressing concerns about the spiritual consequences of their administrative duties. What made this transformation particularly threatening to established sex work communities was that Christianity offered a completely different framework for understanding sexuality, commerce, and human relationships. Where Roman law had created complex accommodations between moral disapproval and economic necessity, Christian doctrine demanded moral consistency even at the cost of practical inconvenience. Where Roman society had developed sophisticated systems for managing the contradictions between stigmatization and dependence, Christian leaders called for the elimination of the contradictions themselves. The shift became visible first in the imperial court, where Christian advisors began influencing policy in ways that had profound implications for marginalized communities. Emperor Constantine himself may not have been personally opposed to prostitution. His own lifestyle was hardly ascetic, but he recognized that supporting Christian moral positions was politically advantageous in an empire where the new religion was gaining followers rapidly. More ominously, the change wasn't limited to official policy. Christian communities throughout the empire began organizing social movements that targeted what they saw as symbols of pagan moral corruption. Brothels, gladiatorial games, and public festivals that celebrated sexuality became focal points for Christian activism in ways that threatened the economic and social networks that sex workers had built over generations. The threat was existential, because Christianity didn't just propose different regulations or tax policies. It challenged the fundamental assumptions that had allowed Roman sex work communities to flourish. The Christian emphasis on sexual purity, monogamous marriage, and the inherent dignity of all human beings created a moral framework that made the Roman system of regulated exploitation impossible to justify or maintain. For the first few decades after Constantine's conversion, the practical effects were limited. Existing legal frameworks remained in place, established businesses continued operating, and the complex social networks that supported sex work communities functioned much as they had before. The perceptive observers could see that the intellectual and moral foundations of the old system were being systematically undermined by new ways of thinking about sexuality, morality, and social organization. The key factors that led to this transformation were both religious and political. Christianity provided a coherent alternative moral framework that appealed to people who had been marginalized or exploited by traditional Roman systems. At the same time, imperial support for Christianity gave this alternative framework the political power necessary to challenge established institutions and practices. The transformation unfolded gradually but relentlessly, beginning with subtle shifts in public attitudes and escalating into systematic legal and social persecution that would ultimately destroy the world that people like Marcus, Acta, and Prisca had built. Understanding this process requires examining how religious conviction, political opportunism, and social anxiety combine to create an unstoppable force for change. The first phase involved what we might call ideological preparation. Christian writers like John Chrysostom and Augustine began developing sophisticated theological arguments against prostitution that went far beyond traditional Roman moral concerns. Where Roman moralists had criticized sex work as degrading to social order, Christian theologians condemned it as sinful in the sight of God. Where Roman law had sought to regulate and contain prostitution, Christian doctrine demanded its complete elimination. These weren't abstract theological debates. They had immediate practical implications. Christian communities began refusing to do business with people associated with sex work, creating economic pressure that gradually isolated these communities from mainstream commercial networks. Christian landowners refused to rent property for brothels. Christian merchants declined to provide supplies to establishments they considered sinful. And Christian craftsmen stopped serving clients from stigmatized industries. The second phase involved direct political action. Christian bishops, armed with imperial favor and growing social influence, began lobbying for specific legislative changes that would restrict or eliminate sex work. Unlike earlier moral reforms that had been primarily symbolic, these efforts were systematic and well-organized, targeting the legal and economic foundations that had allowed sex work communities to prosper. Emperor Constantius II, Constantine's son and successor, proved more willing than his father to translate Christian moral positions into concrete policy. Beginning in the 340s CE, his administration issued a series of edicts that restricted brothel operations, increased penalties for those involved in sex work, and provided legal mechanisms for closing establishments deemed contrary to Christian morality. But the most devastating changes came through what we might recognize today as grassroots social movements. Christian communities throughout the empire began organizing campaigns to identify and shut down local brothels, often using tactics that combined legal pressure, economic boycotts, and social intimidation. These weren't spontaneous uprisings, but coordinated efforts that demonstrated remarkable organizational sophistication. The resistance to these changes was initially substantial and well organized. The networks that sex workers had built over centuries proved remarkably resilient, with established operators adapting their business models to operate within increasingly restrictive environments. They moved operations to less visible locations, developed new methods for connecting with clients, and created alternative revenue streams that were less vulnerable to Christian moral campaigns. Some communities attempted to align themselves with Christian moral frameworks, arguing that their work served important social functions consistent with Christian charity. A few operators actually converted to Christianity and attempted to reshape their businesses as institutions for helping reformed prostitutes reintegrate into respectable society. Though these efforts were generally viewed with suspicion, the breakthrough moment for Christian reformers came during the reign of Emperor Theodosius I in the late 4th century. Theodosius, unlike earlier Christian emperors who had balanced religious conviction with political pragmatism, embraced a more aggressive approach to moral reform that provided Christian activists with unprecedented governmental support. The Theodosian Code, promulgated in 438 CE, represented the culmination of a century-long process of legal transformation. These new laws didn't just regulate sex work, they criminalized it entirely, making it illegal to operate brothels, provide sexual services for money, or even rent property to people engaged in prostitution. The penalties were severe, including confiscation of property, exile, and in some cases corporal punishment. More importantly, the Theodosian Code provided legal mechanisms for citizens to report suspected prostitution activities and receive rewards for successful prosecutions. This created powerful incentives for people to inform on their neighbors while providing Christian activists with official channels for pursuing their moral campaigns. The final phase of transformation involved the systematic dismantling of the social and economic networks that had supported sex work communities for centuries. Properties were confiscated and converted to other uses. Established businesses were forced to close, and the complex web of relationships that had sustained these communities was deliberately destroyed through legal and social pressure. The speed and thoroughness of this transformation were remarkable. Within less than a century, an industry that had been integral to Roman urban life for over 500 years was effectively eliminated from most parts of the empire. The sophisticated communities that had developed their own forms of governance, finance, and social organization were scattered and destroyed, leaving only scattered records to testify to their former existence. The new Christian Roman Empire that emerged from this transformation was fundamentally different from its predecessor, not just in its approach to sexuality, but in its understanding of how society should organize itself around questions of morality, commerce, and human dignity. Where the old system had embraced contradictions and managed them through complex legal and social accommodations, the new Christian approach demanded moral consistency, even when it created practical problems. Cities that had previously generated substantial tax revenue from brothel licenses found themselves facing budget shortfalls. Entertainment districts that had supported thousands of jobs experienced economic collapse. The immediate human cost was substantial. Thousands of people who had made their living in sex work found themselves suddenly criminalized, with few alternatives available for generating income. The support networks that had provided medical care, legal assistance, and mutual aid were dismantled, leaving vulnerable people without resources during unprecedented persecution. Some former sex workers managed to find refuge in Christian institutions that offered assistance to repentant sinners, but these programs typically required complete renunciation of previous life and acceptance of subordinate roles within Christian communities. Women who had previously operated successful businesses found themselves dependent on charity and subject to constant moral supervision. Others attempted to continue their work underground. But the new legal framework made this extremely dangerous. The rewards offered for reporting suspected prostitution created networks of informants that made discreet operation nearly impossible. The severe penalties for conviction meant that even accusations could result in social ostracism and economic ruin. The transformation also affected the broader urban culture that had developed around sex work districts. The festivals, entertainment venues, and social gatherings that had been integral to Roman city life were either eliminated or fundamentally altered to conform to Christian moral standards. The frank discussions of sexuality that had characterized Roman literature and art gave way to more restrictive approaches that emphasized chastity and moral purity. Perhaps most significantly, the new system eliminated the forms of social mobility and economic opportunity that had allowed some people to transcend their marginal status through success in stigmatized industries. The alternative pathways to prosperity and influence that figures like Acta and Marcus had pioneered were no longer available. The Christian approach to addressing the social problems that prostitution had previously managed was fundamentally different from Roman pragmatism. Rather than accepting that some people would engage in sexual commerce and attempting to regulate it safely, Christian leaders sought to eliminate the demand through moral education and the supply through economic assistance to vulnerable women. These efforts achieved mixed results. Christian charitable institutions did provide some support to women who might otherwise have entered sex work, and Christian moral teaching may have reduced demand for commercial sexual services among some populations. But the elimination of legal prostitution also created black markets that were far more dangerous for both workers and clients than the regulated system that had preceded them. Was this transformation ultimately positive or negative for Roman society and the people most directly affected by it? The question defies simple answers and reveals the complexity of moral and social change in any historical period. From a Christian perspective, the elimination of legal prostitution represented a moral victory that reflected God's will and improved society by removing institutions that degraded human dignity. Christian leaders argued that the short-term disruptions were justified by the long-term benefits of creating a more virtuous society aligned with Christian principles. From the perspective of former sex workers and the communities that had supported them, the transformation was an unmitigated disaster that destroyed livelihoods, eliminated social support networks, and criminalized survival strategies that had allowed marginalized people to maintain some degree of autonomy and economic security. Broader social effects were equally complex. The elimination of legal prostitution may have reduced some forms of sexual exploitation, but it also created underground markets that were far more dangerous and less subject to regulation or oversight. The moral consistency that Christian reformers celebrated came at the cost of practical mechanisms for managing social problems that didn't simply disappear because they had been criminalized. From a historical perspective, this transformation represents one of the most dramatic examples of how religious and moral movements can fundamentally reshape social institutions within relatively short periods. The speed and thoroughness with which centuries-old systems were dismantled demonstrates both the power of organized moral conviction and the fragility of social arrangements that depend on unofficial accommodations and pragmatic compromises. Perhaps most significantly, the Christian transformation of Roman attitudes toward sex work established patterns that would influence Western civilization for over a millennium. The association of Christianity with sexual purity, the criminalization of commercial sexuality, and the emphasis on marriage and family as the only legitimate context for sexual expression became defining characteristics of European society. That persisted well into the modern era. Whether these changes represented moral progress or social Regression remains a matter of perspective, but their historical importance is undeniable. The world that people like Prima, Marcus, and Acta had created was gone forever, replaced by something fundamentally different that would shape human relationships and social organization for centuries to come. In the years and decades that followed, the Theodosian Code's complete criminalization of prostitution, the Roman world witnessed a fascinating and often tragic process of adaptation as both individuals and communities struggled to navigate the new moral landscape that Christianity had imposed. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but from that chaos emerged new forms of organization, resistance, and accommodation that would shape European attitudes towards sexuality and commerce for centuries to come. The most visible change was the disappearance of the open brothel districts that had been integral to Roman urban life for over 5 centuries. The Subura in Rome, the entertainment quarters of Alexandria, the harbor districts of Antioch, all were transformed almost overnight from bustling commercial zones into carefully monitored Christian neighborhoods, where any hint of impropriety could result in investigation and punishment. The elaborate frescoes that had advertised services were painted over with Christian symbols. The stone beds were removed or converted to other uses, and the buildings themselves were either demolished or repurposed as workshops, storehouses, or Christian charitable institutions. But beneath this surface transformation, more complex processes were at work. The demand for sexual services hadn't disappeared just because they had been criminalized, and neither had the economic pressures that had driven people into sex work in the first place. What emerged was a shadow economy that operated with far greater secrecy and danger than the regulated system it replaced, creating new forms of exploitation and vulnerability that the Christian reformers had never anticipated. The human cost was immediate and devastating. Thousands of people who had built their lives around the sex trade found themselves not only unemployed but criminalized, with few legal alternatives for generating income. The support networks that had provided medical care, financial assistance, and social connection were dismantled, leaving vulnerable people isolated and desperate. Some attempted to continue their work clandestinely, but the rewards for informants and the severe penalties for conviction made this extremely dangerous. Christian charitable institutions did attempt to provide alternatives, establishing houses for reformed prostitutes and programs designed to help former sex workers find respectable employment. But these programs were often inadequately funded, morally restrictive, and designed more to demonstrate Christian virtue than to address the practical needs of displaced workers. Women who had previously operated independent businesses found themselves dependent on charity and subject to constant moral supervision. More significantly, the criminalization of prostitution created new forms of criminal organization that were far more exploitative than the regulated businesses they replaced. Underground networks developed to connect clients with services, but these operated without any of the legal protections or community oversight that had characterized the traditional system. Violence, fraud, and exploitation became more common as the industry moved into the shadows. The economic disruption extended far beyond sex work itself. The entertainment districts that had supported thousands of jobs in restaurants, shops, bathhouses, and service businesses experienced severe economic decline. Municipal governments lost substantial tax revenue, while the costs of enforcement and prosecution strained budgets. Some cities that had depended heavily on revenue from the sex trade faced genuine fiscal crises that took decades to resolve. Yet the transformation also created new opportunities for some. Christian institutions gained power and resources as they took over properties and assumed responsibility for managing the social problems that prostitution had previously addressed. Moral entrepreneurs who positioned themselves as guardians of Christian virtue found new sources of influence and income. The underground networks that emerged to serve continuing demand created opportunities for those willing to operate outside the law. The Christian transformation didn't eliminate the social and economic forces that had sustained Roman sex work. It simply forced them to find new forms of expression and organization. In place of the openly operating businesses and established networks that had characterized the traditional system, new types of operators emerged too, adapted to the changed legal and social environment while serving continuing demand. The most successful of these new players were what we might call moral entrepreneurs, individuals who found ways to profit from the Christian emphasis on sexual purity while secretly facilitating the very activities they publicly condemned. These included Christian priests who offered spiritual counseling to wealthy clients that went far beyond theological guidance, monastery officials who maintained reform institutions that functioned more like exclusive brothels, and respectable matrons who operated charitable houses that provided discreet services to carefully vetted customers. Perhaps the most sophisticated of these operations were the Byzantine charitable institutions that emerged in Constantinople and other eastern cities during the 6th and 7th centuries. Officially dedicated to helping reformed prostitutes reintegrate into Christian society, these establishments actually provided high-end sexual services to wealthy clients under the guise of religious charity. The operators understood that the new Christian moral framework made discretion more valuable than ever before, and they charged premium prices for services that came with guarantees of secrecy and social protection. These institutions were often funded by wealthy patrons who publicly supported Christian moral reforms, while privately maintaining access to the services they claimed to oppose. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it was also highly profitable. Operators like Theodora, not the Empress, but a contemporary businesswoman whose story survives in fragmentary legal documents, built substantial fortunes by providing what amounted to exclusive membership clubs for elite clients who couldn't afford to be associated with anything resembling traditional prostitution. The underground networks that emerged to serve less wealthy clients were far more dangerous and exploitative. Without the legal protections and community oversight that had characterized traditional sex work, these operations were dominated by criminal organizations that used violence and intimidation to control both workers and clients. Among the most tragic new players were the children who were increasingly drawn into underground sexual commerce as adult workers became scarcer and more expensive. The traditional Roman system had maintained relatively clear boundaries between adult and child sexuality, but the criminalization of adult prostitution created incentives for operators to exploit younger and more vulnerable populations. The rise of monasticism also created unexpected opportunities and challenges. Some monastic communities became genuine refuges for people seeking to escape sex work, providing economic alternatives and social support that helped former workers build new lives. But other monasteries became centers of sexual exploitation, using their moral authority and legal immunity to operate with impunity. Perhaps most significantly, the new Christian moral framework created opportunities for female entrepreneurs who could navigate the complex relationship between religious virtue and sexual commerce. Women like Anna of Constantinople built successful businesses by positioning themselves as moral reformers while actually organizing sophisticated networks that provided sexual services to elite clients. Despite the dramatic transformation of the legal and social framework governing sexuality, many of the fundamental problems that had characterized Roman sex work persisted in new forms. The criminalization of prostitution didn't eliminate the economic pressures that drove people into sexual commerce, nor did it address the social inequalities that made some populations particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The most persistent issue was the continued existence of sexual slavery, which became more common and more brutal as the industry moved underground. The traditional Roman system had maintained legal distinctions between different categories of sex workers and provided some protections for those who weren't slaves. But the Christian moral framework actually made it harder to address the most serious abuses by eliminating the legal categories that had previously distinguished between voluntary and coercive sexual commerce. Underground networks that emerged to serve continuing demand showed little interest in maintaining the distinctions that had characterized traditional Roman practice. Operators focused on profit maximization and risk minimization, which meant exploiting the most vulnerable workers possible while charging premium prices for services that came with reduced legal exposure. The problem of violence against sex workers also became more severe as the industry lost the community oversight and legal protections that had provided some measure of security under the traditional system. Workers operating clandestinely had no recourse against violent or dishonest clients, no community networks to provide assistance during emergencies, and no legal mechanisms for addressing disputes or obtaining compensation for injuries. Economic exploitation took new forms as well. The elimination of legitimate business structures meant that workers had no legal protections against wage theft, no mechanisms for resolving contractual disputes, and no access to the financial services that had allowed some to accumulate capital and achieve independence under the traditional system. The health problems that had always been associated with sex work became more severe as the industry lost access to medical services and community health measures. Criminalization made it dangerous for workers to seek medical assistance, while also eliminating the community structures that had provided mutual aid during illness or injury. Perhaps most tragically, the Christian emphasis on moral redemption created new forms of psychological exploitation that were often more damaging than physical abuse. Workers who sought help from Christian institutions were typically required to undergo public confession and penance that involved detailed recounting of their sexual activities. These procedures, supposedly designed to facilitate spiritual healing, often functioned as forms of humiliation and control. The cyclical nature of these problems became increasingly apparent as the decades passed. Each attempt to intensify moral enforcement created new incentives for underground operators to develop more sophisticated methods of concealment and control. Each expansion of Christian charitable programs created new opportunities for exploitation by operators who understood how to manipulate religious language and institutions. Compared to the earlier Roman system of regulated prostitution, this Christian approach revealed fundamental differences in how societies can choose to manage the intersection of sexuality, morality, and economic necessity. The contrast illuminates broader questions about the effectiveness of moral legislation and the unintended consequences of well-intentioned social reforms. The traditional Roman approach had been pragmatic rather than moralistic, accepting that sexual commerce would exist and attempting to manage it through legal regulation, taxation, and social accommodation. This system had created space for some workers to achieve economic independence and social mobility, while providing legal protections and community support networks that help manage the inherent risks and vulnerabilities of the industry. The Christian approach, by contrast, was idealistic rather than pragmatic, seeking to eliminate sexual commerce entirely through moral education, legal prohibition, and social pressure. This approach achieved greater moral consistency and may have reduced overall participation in prostitution, but it also eliminated the legal protections and social supports that had made the traditional system less exploitative than its underground successor. The comparison reveals that moral consistency and practical effectiveness often conflict when dealing with complex social problems. The Roman system's acceptance of contradiction had allowed for pragmatic accommodations that served multiple social needs simultaneously. The Christian system's demand for moral purity eliminated these accommodations, but didn't eliminate the underlying social problems they had been designed to address. What's particularly striking is how the Christian transformation affected different social classes differently. Wealthy clients were often able to maintain access to sexual services through the elaborate underground networks and charitable institutions that emerged to serve elite demand. The poor, by contrast, found themselves either completely excluded from commercial sexual services or forced to participate in far more dangerous and exploitative underground markets. The gender implications were equally complex. The traditional Roman system had provided some opportunities for women to achieve economic independence through sex work, despite the legal and social restrictions they faced. The Christian system eliminated these opportunities while creating new forms of female religious authority. But these new roles typically required acceptance of subordinate positions within male-dominated religious hierarchies. From a comparative perspective, the Christian transformation of Roman attitudes toward sex work can be seen as an early example of how religious and moral movements can reshape social institutions, but also as a demonstration of the limitations of approaches that prioritize moral consistency over practical effectiveness. The speed and thoroughness of the transformation show the power of organized moral conviction, but the persistence and intensification of the problems the reforms were meant to address reveal the dangers of eliminating pragmatic accommodations without providing effective alternatives. Sex work had created opportunities for creative adaptation and resistance. The Christian approach, by contrast, was idealistic rather than pragmatic, seeking to eliminate sexual commerce entirely through moral education, legal prohibition, and social pressure. This approach achieved greater moral consistency and may have reduced overall participation in prostitution, but it also eliminated the legal protections and social supports that had made the traditional system less exploitative than its underground successor. The comparison reveals that moral consistency and practical effectiveness often conflict when dealing with complex social problems. The Roman system's acceptance of contradiction had allowed for pragmatic accommodations that served multiple social needs simultaneously. The Christian system's demand for moral purity eliminated these accommodations, but didn't eliminate the underlying social problems they had been designed to address. What's particularly striking is how the Christian transformation affected different social classes differently. Wealthy clients were often able to maintain access to sexual services through the elaborate underground networks and charitable institutions that emerged to serve elite demand. The poor, by contrast, found themselves either completely excluded from commercial sexual services or forced to participate in far more dangerous and exploitative underground markets. The gender implications were equally complex. The traditional Roman system had provided some opportunities for women to achieve economic independence through sex work, despite the legal and social restrictions they faced. The Christian system eliminated these opportunities while creating new forms of female religious authority. But these new roles typically required acceptance of subordinate positions within male-dominated religious hierarchies. From a comparative perspective, the Christian transformation of Roman attitudes toward sex work can be seen as an early example of how religious and moral movements can reshape social institutions, but also as a demonstration of the limitations of approaches that prioritize moral consistency over practical effectiveness. The speed and thoroughness of the transformation show the power of organized moral conviction, but the persistence and intensification of the problems the reforms were meant to address reveal the dangers of eliminating pragmatic accommodations without providing effective alternatives. The legacy of this transformation would influence European approaches to sexuality and social policy for over a millennium, establishing patterns of moral legislation, religious authority, and underground resistance that would persist well into the modern era. By the late 3rd century CE, signs pointed to a transformation that would reshape Roman society forever. The old gods were losing their grip, and with them, the sexual freedoms that had defined Roman culture for centuries. If you thought the empire's military troubles were its biggest concern, think again. A quiet revolution was brewing in the bedrooms and brothels of Rome. The warning signs were everywhere, though most Romans missed them entirely. Christian communities, once huddled in secret gatherings, now openly criticized the moral fabric of Roman society. Their particular target, the very institution that had thrived in every Roman city, organized prostitution. Meanwhile, economic pressures were mounting. The silver mines of Spain were depleting, barbarian raids disrupted trade routes, and inflation made even basic pleasures expensive for ordinary citizens. Let's be honest, the Romans had grown complacent. For centuries, their brothels had operated with the efficiency of any other business. Tax collectors knew exactly which establishments to visit. Magistrates understood the legal frameworks, and everyone from slaves to senators participated in a system that seemed as permanent as the Colosseum itself. Sound familiar? It's the classic story of an institution so entrenched that nobody imagines it could ever change. The key players saw different pieces of the puzzle. Brothel owners noticed declining profits, but blamed temporary economic downturns. Provincial governors worried about Christian agitators, but treated them as a minor sect. Even Emperor Diocletian, despite his massive reforms, focused on administrative efficiency rather than moral transformation. What they all missed was the fundamental shift happening in Roman hearts and minds. Christian bishops, like John Chrysostom, weren't just preaching against sin. They were offering an entirely different vision of human sexuality and dignity. To be fair, their message resonated because Roman society had always harbored deep contradictions about prostitution. The same culture that legalized and taxed brothel work also stigmatized the workers themselves. The same men who visited prostitutes regularly also demanded virginity from their daughters. Resistance to the inevitable change came from predictable quarters. Brothel owners formed associations to protect their interests. Conservative senators argued that traditional Roman values were under attack. Even some prostitutes themselves resisted, fearing unemployment in a society that offered few alternatives for women without family connections. Still, the momentum was building. Imperial edicts began restricting certain types of sexual commerce. Local magistrates, increasingly Christian themselves, found excuses to close troublesome establishments. The old legal protections that had safeguarded the industry were quietly being eroded, one administrative decision at a time. And yet, most Romans continued their daily routines, visiting their favorite establishments, conducting business as usual. They couldn't imagine that an institution woven so deeply into the fabric of their civilization could simply disappear. That's right. They were about to learn one of history's hardest lessons. No matter how permanent something seems, everything eventually changes. The end didn't come with a dramatic imperial decree or a single day of reckoning. Instead, Roman prostitution died the way most institutions do, slowly, then suddenly, through a combination of legal pressure, social transformation, and economic necessity. Constantine's conversion in 312 CE marked the beginning of the end, though few recognized it at the time. His initial reforms seemed modest enough. Restrictions on forcing freeborn women into prostitution, limitations on brothel locations near churches, requirements for better treatment of enslaved sex workers. Brothel owners grumbled, but adapted. raising prices to cover increased compliance costs and relocating to less prominent neighborhoods. Meanwhile, Christian influence spread through Roman society like water through limestone, invisibly but inexorably. Wealthy Christian women began funding hostels for former prostitutes. Bishops preached against sexual commerce with increasing boldness. Most importantly, conversion offered an alternative identity for women trapped in the trade. If you thought joining a Christian community meant automatic acceptance, think again. But it did provide a path out that hadn't existed before. The specific events that sealed the industry's fate unfolded across several decades. In 343 CE, Constans and Constanius II issued laws explicitly condemning prostitution as incompatible with Christian society. Local enforcement varied wildly. Some governors ignored the new regulations entirely, while others used them to settle personal scores or extract bribes from brothel owners. The final major players in this transformation were an unlikely group. Theodora, who would later become Empress Justinian's wife, had worked as an actress and possibly prostitute before her remarkable social ascent. Her personal experience informed some of the most comprehensive anti-prostitution legislation in Roman history. Meanwhile, bishops like Augustine of Hippo developed theological arguments that reframed sexuality entirely, moving it from the public sphere into the private realm of marriage. But let's be clear, the old system didn't go quietly. Last attempts to preserve the traditional arrangements took various forms. Some brothel owners converted their establishments into taverns or boarding houses while quietly maintaining their original services. Others relocated to frontier regions where imperial authority remained weak. A few attempted to rebrand their operations as religious institutions, claiming their workers were temple servants in the old tradition. The most dramatic resistance came from unexpected quarters. In 387 CE, riots broke out in Antioch when local authorities attempted to close the city's traditional red light district. Citizens weren't just defending prostitution. They were defending a way of life that had defined Roman urban culture for centuries. The riots were brutally suppressed, sending a clear message about the new moral order. Gradually, the decline became undeniable. Tax records from the 4th and 5th centuries show a dramatic decrease in revenues from sexual commerce. Archaeological evidence reveals brothel buildings being converted to workshops, residences, or Christian meeting spaces. The famous Luminaria of Pompeii had been buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, but similar establishments across the empire were now being buried by history itself. Symbolic endpoints varied by region. In Rome itself, the last official brothel district was closed by papal order in 590 CE, though unofficial prostitution continued. In Constantinople, Justinian's comprehensive legal reforms of 529-534 CE effectively criminalized organized sexual commerce throughout the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire, already fragmenting under barbarian pressure, saw the old systems collapse along with imperial authority itself. Of course, prostitution didn't disappear entirely. Human nature doesn't change that dramatically. But the Roman system of legal, regulated, socially accepted sexual commerce was finished. What replaced it was a patchwork of underground networks, private arrangements, and informal markets that operated in the shadows rather than the sunlight. The transformation was complete, but its architects had succeeded almost too well in eliminating institutional prostitution. They had also eliminated many of the legal protections and social services that had made the system relatively humane by ancient standards. The women who had once worked in regulated establishments with some measure of legal protection now found themselves operating in a much more dangerous and exploitative underground economy. Still, for Christian reformers, the victory was worth celebrating. They had proven that even the most entrenched social institutions could be transformed through sustained moral pressure and political will. The secret life of Roman brothel workers was about to become just that, a secret, hidden from history for over a millennium. The fall of Roman prostitution wasn't inevitable, despite how it might seem in hindsight. Multiple factors combined in a perfect storm that no single cause could have created alone. Let's be honest about what really drove this transformation. It wasn't just moral outrage or religious fervor, though both played crucial roles. Christianity provided the ideological framework, but economics supplied much of the actual pressure. The Roman Empire's financial crisis of the 3rd century had lasting effects that rippled through every aspect of society. Brothel owners, like other business people, faced increased taxes, debased currency, and disrupted supply chains. When your profit margins are already thin and the government keeps demanding more revenue, moral pressure becomes the final straw rather than the primary cause. Internal problems within the industry itself made it vulnerable to external attack. The Roman system had always depended on a steady supply of enslaved workers, but warfare patterns were changing. Instead of the massive slave-taking campaigns of earlier centuries, Rome now faced defensive wars against enemies who kept their own captives. Meanwhile, Christian influence was making Romans increasingly uncomfortable with slavery itself, not just sexual slavery. External pressures came from multiple directions simultaneously. Barbarian groups settling within Roman territory brought different cultural values about sexuality and family structure. Many Germanic tribes had stricter sexual codes than Romans, viewing prostitution as a sign of civilizational weakness. Sound familiar? Cultural conquest often works both ways, and the conquerors found themselves influenced by their subjects' moral standards. The role of individuals versus historical forces presents a fascinating case study. Without Constantine's conversion, would the transformation have happened at all? To be fair, other mystery religions were already challenging Roman sexual norms. Mithraism emphasized sexual purity, while various Gnostic sects viewed physical pleasure as spiritually corrupting. Christianity succeeded partly because it offered the most comprehensive alternative social structure. Not just alternative beliefs, but individual decisions mattered enormously. When Empress Theodora used her personal experience to inform anti-prostitution legislation, she was doing more than enacting policy. She was rewriting the possibilities for women's lives. When bishops like John Chrysostom preached against sexual commerce, they weren't just condemning sin. They were offering dignity to people society had written off. What could have been done differently? Brothel owners might have adapted more successfully by embracing gradual reform rather than resisting all change. Some did try this approach, improving working conditions and emphasizing the voluntary nature of their workers' participation. But they were fighting historical momentum, not just specific policies. Roman authorities could have separated the regulation of sexual commerce from broader questions of Christian morality. Some provincial governors attempted this approach, maintaining legal frameworks while accommodating new religious sensibilities. These compromises might have preserved the industry in modified form, but they required more political skill than most officials possessed. The question of inevitability versus contingency remains open. Christianity's triumph wasn't predetermined. It required specific historical circumstances, skilled leadership, and more than a little luck. But once those circumstances aligned, the transformation became nearly unstoppable. And yet, the speed of change suggests that Roman prostitution contained the seeds of its own destruction. An institution that depended on social inequality, sexual exploitation, and moral compartmentalization was always vulnerable to movements that challenged those foundations. Christianity didn't create Roman society's contradictions about sexuality. It simply exposed them. Still, The end came faster than anyone expected. Within 2 centuries, an institution that had seemed as permanent as Roman roads or aqueducts had virtually disappeared from legal existence. The transformation was so complete that later generations would struggle to understand how their ancestors had ever accepted such arrangements. The immediate aftermath was chaos disguised as moral victory. Christian leaders celebrated the triumph of virtue over vice, but nobody had prepared for the practical consequences of eliminating an institution that had employed thousands of people and generated substantial tax revenue across the empire. Who stepped into the vacuum? The answer varied dramatically by region and social class. In major cities, Christian charitable organizations attempted to provide alternative employment for former sex workers. Convents offered shelter, though admission requirements were strict, and the transition often difficult. Some women found work in textile production or domestic service, but wages were typically much lower than what they had earned in prostitution. Meanwhile, underground networks quickly emerged to serve continuing demand. These new arrangements lacked the legal protections and health regulations that had characterized Roman brothels at their best. Former brothel owners sometimes continued operating as private matchmakers or party organizers, providing sexual services through informal networks that were harder for authorities to track and regulate. Short-term consequences rippled through Roman society in unexpected ways. Tax collectors found themselves scrambling to replace lost revenue from brothel licensing and taxation. Local economies and entertainment districts suffered as foot traffic declined. Bathhouses, taverns, and theaters that had depended on brothel customers experienced reduced business. Contemporary reactions revealed the complexity of public opinion. While Christian writers celebrated moral progress, secular authors like Ammianus Marcellinus worried about hypocrisy and social disruption. Private letters and graffiti suggest that many ordinary Romans felt confused by the rapid changes in social norms. What had been normal behavior for centuries was suddenly criminalized, creating anxiety about other aspects of traditional Roman culture. The most interesting contemporary reactions came from women themselves. Some former prostitutes embraced Christian conversion as genuine liberation, finding dignity and community they had never experienced. Others resented the loss of economic independence and social mobility that sex work had provided. A few became vocal advocates for the new moral order, using their personal stories to support Christian arguments against prostitution. Attempts at revival or continuation took various forms. Some wealthy Romans maintained private arrangements that resembled the old system while avoiding its public aspects. Certain religious festivals continued to feature sexual elements, though these were gradually eliminated or transformed. Border regions and client kingdoms sometimes maintained traditional practices longer than the imperial heartland, and yet, the most significant immediate legacy was psychological rather than practical. Romans had to confront the reality that their most basic social institutions could be completely transformed within a single generation. This realization would prove crucial as the empire faced other fundamental challenges in the centuries that followed. To be fair, not everyone viewed the changes negatively. Many Romans had always felt uncomfortable with institutionalized prostitution, even while participating in it. The Christian transformation gave them permission to align their behavior with their consciences, creating a sense of moral coherence that had been missing from traditional Roman culture. Still, the immediate aftermath demonstrated that moral revolutions create their own problems, often quite different from the ones they set out to solve. The legacy of Roman prostitution shaped Western civilization in ways that would surprise most people today. For over a millennium after the fall of Rome, European society struggled with the question that Romans had seemingly solved: how you manage human sexuality and complex urban environments. The Roman approach, legal regulation, taxation, and social acceptance disappeared so completely that later generations had to reinvent the wheel, usually with far less success. Medieval Europe inherited Christianity's moral framework, but not Rome's practical solutions. The result was 1,000 years of sexual hypocrisy that made Roman contradictions look modest by comparison. Church authorities condemned prostitution while tacitly accepting its necessity. Kings and nobles maintained elaborate systems of concubinage while preaching marital fidelity. Sound familiar? The pattern of official disapproval combined with unofficial tolerance became the defining characteristic of Western approaches to sexuality. How later generations viewed Roman sexual practices reveals fascinating shifts in cultural perspective. Medieval chroniclers, when they mentioned Roman brothels at all, portrayed them as evidence of pagan decadence. Renaissance humanists showed more nuanced interest, recognizing the organizational sophistication of Roman sexual commerce while maintaining moral distance. Enlightenment philosophers like Edward Gibbon used Roman sexual freedom as a measuring stick for civilizational sophistication, though they often got the details wrong. Let's be honest, myths developed faster than realities could be preserved. By the 18th century, popular imagination had transformed Roman brothels into exotic fantasy locations, populated by beautiful, willing courtesans living lives of luxury and pleasure. This romanticized vision bore little resemblance to the harsh realities we've explored, but it proved remarkably persistent. Even today, popular culture tends to glamorize ancient prostitution while ignoring its exploitative foundations. The most significant historical impact involved legal frameworks. Roman law's approach to sexual commerce, distinguishing between voluntary and coerced participation, regulating working conditions, protecting certain classes of women while exploiting others, established precedents that European legal systems would eventually rediscover. But that rediscovery took centuries, and the interim period saw legal approaches that were often more oppressive than anything Rome had devised. Why Roman prostitution remained important to later societies had everything to do with unfinished business. Christianity had eliminated institutional sexual commerce without solving the underlying social problems. Urban poverty, limited economic opportunities for women, male sexual demands, and the complex relationship between sexuality and social power. Medieval and early modern societies found themselves dealing with the same issues Romans had faced, but without Rome's pragmatic tools. Meanwhile, the Roman model influenced Islamic approaches to sexuality and marriage in complex ways. Islamic societies developed different solutions: temporary marriage, concubinage systems, and legal frameworks that acknowledged male sexual needs while protecting female honor. These approaches borrowed some Roman practical elements while rejecting Roman moral relativism. The forgotten reality was that Roman sexual commerce had represented one of history's most sophisticated attempts to manage the intersection of sexuality, economics, and social control. Later, societies often assumed they were addressing these issues for the first time, unaware that Romans had already experimented with many of the same solutions and documented both their successes and failures. And yet, perhaps forgetting was necessary. Roman approaches to sexuality were so thoroughly entangled with slavery, social inequality, and imperial exploitation that later societies might have found it impossible to separate the useful elements from the morally unacceptable ones. The complete break with Roman sexual culture, however traumatic, may have been essential for developing more humane approaches to human dignity and sexual autonomy. Still, the historical impact remains visible for those who know where to look. Every modern debate about sexual commerce, regulation versus prohibition, worker protection versus moral legislation, echoes arguments that first played out in Roman forums and bathhouses 2,000 years ago. Today, we can see echoes of Roman sexual commerce in ways that would make ancient Romans feel surprisingly at home in our modern world. The fundamental dynamics haven't changed as much as we might like to think. Urban societies still struggle with the same basic tensions between sexual desires, economic necessities, moral principles, and practical governance that Romans faced 2 millennia ago. Consider Amsterdam's red light district or Nevada's legal brothels. These modern arrangements mirror Roman approaches in striking ways. Government regulation, taxation of sexual services, designated areas for sexual commerce, and attempts to balance moral concerns with practical realities. The Dutch system, in particular, resembles Roman prostitution more than most people realize. Legal recognition, worker protections, municipal oversight, and social acceptance within defined boundaries. Let's be clear, the technology has changed, but the underlying issues remain identical. Modern escort services operating through websites and apps face the same challenges as Roman brothel owners: client screening, worker safety, legal compliance, and social stigma. The Internet has replaced the Roman system of public advertising and location-based marketing. But the basic business model of connecting sexual service providers with customers remains fundamentally unchanged. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes obvious when you examine modern sex tourism. Ancient Romans traveled throughout their empire seeking sexual experiences unavailable at home. Different ethnicities, exotic practices, escape from social constraints. Today's sex tourists follow remarkably similar patterns, traveling from more regulated societies to less regulated ones, seeking the same combination of sexual variety and social anonymity that motivated their Roman predecessors. The parallels extend beyond commerce to social attitudes. Modern societies exhibit the same contradictions Romans did: simultaneous fascination and revulsion, legal tolerance and social stigma, public disapproval and private participation. If you thought modern sexual hypocrisy was unique, think again. Romans perfected these contradictions centuries before. Christianity complicated the picture. Similar patterns appear in different contexts across contemporary culture. The modern pornography industry operates on principles Romans would recognize immediately: mass production of sexual content, specialized markets for different tastes, economic exploitation disguised as entertainment, and the creation of sexual personas distinct from performers' real identities. The technologies differ, but the underlying dynamics of sexual commodification remain remarkably consistent. Corporate sex culture, strip clubs at business conferences, escort services for client entertainment, sexualized marketing and advertising, mirrors Roman practices of using sexual access to facilitate business relationships and demonstrate social status. Modern executives entertaining clients at gentlemen's clubs are participating in rituals that would seem familiar to Roman merchants 2,000 years ago. Meanwhile, the modern debate over sex work legalization reproduces Roman legal discussions almost exactly. Contemporary arguments about worker safety, government regulation, moral legislation, and social harm follow the same logical patterns that Roman jurists explored in their legal commentaries. The specific laws may be different, but the fundamental questions about state authority over private behavior remain identical. Even more striking are the parallels in how different societies handle sexual commerce today. Countries with Roman legal traditions, much of continental Europe, tend toward regulation and tolerance. Countries with Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, Britain, America, much of the former British Empire, tend toward prohibition and criminalization. The division roughly mirrors the ancient split between Roman pragmatism and Christian moralism. Social media has created new forms of sexual commerce that Romans would recognize as variations on familiar themes. OnlyFans, campsites, and similar platforms allow performers to maintain direct relationships with customers while avoiding traditional intermediaries, much like independent Roman prostitutes who worked outside the brothel system. The economic dynamics of subscription-based sexual content mirror Roman patterns of regular client relationships and personalized service. To be fair, modern societies have developed protections for sexual service providers that Romans never imagined. Worker rights, healthcare access, legal recourse for exploitation, and social services represent genuine advances over ancient practices. But these improvements often exist despite rather than because of legal frameworks, suggesting that societies still haven't found optimal solutions to problems Romans grappled with centuries ago. And yet, the most important parallel may be the one we're least comfortable acknowledging. Like Romans, we've created systems of sexual commerce that simultaneously exploit and empower, degrade and liberate, marginalize and normalize. We're still struggling with the same fundamental tension between individual autonomy and social control that defined Roman approaches to sexuality. The lessons for contemporary issues are both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because human societies have successfully managed these challenges before. Sobering because the solutions always involve difficult trade-offs between competing values that no society has ever perfectly resolved. Even now, Roman approaches to sexual commerce influence modern academic study, popular culture, political discourse, and social movements in ways most people never recognize. The ghost of Roman pragmatism haunts every contemporary debate about sex work legalization, even when participants have never heard of ancient Roman legal codes. Academic study of sexuality and gender draws heavily on Roman examples, though often without acknowledging the debt. Feminist scholars analyzing the intersection of sexuality and economic power regularly cite Roman evidence to demonstrate that patriarchal control of women's bodies has ancient precedents. Meanwhile, sex work advocates point to Roman legal protections as evidence that societies can regulate sexual commerce without criminalizing it entirely. Popular culture's fascination with Roman decadence feeds directly into modern pornography, fashion, and entertainment. From HBO's Rome to countless adult websites themed around Roman orgies, contemporary sexual fantasies still draw on romanticized visions of ancient sexual freedom. These portrayals usually bear little resemblance to historical reality, but they demonstrate Roman sexuality's continuing hold on popular imagination. Political discourse about prostitution, whether people realize it or not, still revolves around questions Romans first articulated. Should the state regulate private sexual behavior? Can sexual commerce ever be truly voluntary? What's the difference between marriage and prostitution? How do societies balance moral principles with practical necessities? These Roman questions have never been definitively answered. Social movements on all sides of contemporary sex work debates invoke Roman precedents, usually selectively. Prohibition advocates point to Roman exploitation and social inequality as evidence that sexual commerce inevitably harms women. Legalization advocates cite Roman regulation and worker protections as proof that societies can manage sexual commerce humanely. Both sides are partially right and partially wrong, which is exactly the kind of complex legacy Romans would have expected. Why people still care about Roman sexual practices has everything to do with unfinished business. Modern societies are still trying to solve problems Romans identified but never fully resolved. How do you protect vulnerable people while preserving individual autonomy? How do you acknowledge sexual realities while maintaining social values? How do you balance competing claims of morality, economics, and personal freedom? The continuing influence appears most strongly in legal scholarship, where Roman law principles still inform contemporary approaches to sexual commerce regulation. That's right. Lawyers arguing about modern prostitution laws are still, in many cases, working within intellectual frameworks that Roman jurists established 2,000 years ago. Looking back across the centuries we've explored together, we've seen a world that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more brutal than most people imagine. The secret life of Roman brothel workers reveals the fundamental tensions that define all human societies. The struggle between individual dignity and economic necessity, the conflict between moral ideals and practical realities, the eternal dance between power and vulnerability that plays out in bedrooms as much as battlefields. The key patterns that emerge from this journey would be familiar to anyone living today. Romans created elaborate systems to manage sexuality and then spent centuries arguing about whether those systems were moral, practical, or sustainable. They developed legal frameworks that protected some people while exploiting others. They built institutions that simultaneously empowered and degraded the people who worked within them. Sound familiar? These are the same contradictions modern societies grapple with, just with different vocabulary. Our most surprising discoveries challenge comfortable assumptions about both ancient and modern worlds. Romans weren't the sexually liberated sophisticates of popular imagination. They were deeply conflicted about sexuality, constantly negotiating between competing values of personal freedom, social order, family honor, and religious obligation. Meanwhile, the Christian transformation wasn't simply moral progress. It eliminated practical solutions without replacing them with better alternatives, creating problems that societies are still trying to solve. The most important takeaways from this exploration go beyond sexuality to fundamental questions about how societies function. Every civilization must decide how to balance individual autonomy with social stability, how to manage economic inequality, how to treat vulnerable populations, and how to reconcile moral principles with human nature. Romans addressed these challenges through their approach to sexual commerce, but the underlying issues appear in every aspect of social organization. Let's be honest, our understanding has evolved dramatically over the course of this journey. We began with simple assumptions about Roman decadence and Christian virtue, but we've discovered a much more complex reality where victims and victimizers often occupied the same bodies, where moral progress created new forms of exploitation, where practical solutions generated their own ethical problems. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson is that change is always possible. An institution that seemed as permanent as Roman roads, legal, profitable, socially integrated, politically protected, could be completely transformed within a few generations. If Romans could eliminate practices that had defined their civilization for centuries, modern societies can certainly address their own entrenched problems. Meanwhile, the human stories we've encountered remind us that historical forces always play out through individual lives. Behind every legal code and economic statistic were real people making difficult choices with limited options, trying to survive and occasionally thrive within systems they rarely chose for themselves. Their experiences matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as windows into the eternal human condition. Still, our journey leaves us with more questions than answers, which is exactly as it should be. History doesn't provide simple lessons or easy solutions. It offers perspective, context, and the humbling recognition that every generation faces versions of the same fundamental challenges. The secret life of Roman brothel workers becomes a mirror reflecting our own secret struggles with dignity, survival, morality, and hope. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've discovered about the secret life of Roman brothel workers. A story found in a papyrus fragment from 4th century Egypt. When the old world was dying and the new one struggling to be born, Her name was Apollonia, and she worked in a small establishment near the harbor in Alexandria. The papyrus records a legal dispute over her contract, not the kind of dramatic tale that usually survives from ancient times, but exactly the kind of mundane human story that reveals deeper truths about how people actually lived. Apollonia had been born free, but sold herself into sexual service to pay her father's debts. The contract specified that she would work for 3 years, during which time her earnings would go to her owner, minus costs for food, clothing, and housing. After 3 years, she would be free to leave with a small payment to help her start a new life. It was, by Roman standards, a relatively humane arrangement, certainly better than slavery, arguably better than destitution. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. When her 3 years ended, Apollonia chose to stay, not because she was forced to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had built relationships, developed skills, and found a kind of security that the outside world couldn't offer. She renegotiated her contract as a free woman, keeping a larger share of her earnings while continuing to work in the same establishment. The legal dispute arose when Christian authorities in Alexandria attempted to shut down her brothel. Apollonia sued to protect her livelihood, arguing that she was a free woman making voluntary choices about her own body and economic future. The authorities countered that no woman could truly consent to prostitution, that the practice corrupted public morals, and that Christian society had an obligation to save her from herself, whether she wanted salvation or not. Why this story encapsulates our broader theme should be obvious by now. Here we see all the contradictions we've explored: individual agency versus social protection, economic necessity versus moral idealism, personal choice versus cultural transformation. Apollonia embodies the complexity of human experience that simple moral categories can't capture. What her story reveals is that the secret life of Roman brothel workers was never really about sex. It was about survival, adaptation, and the eternal human struggle to maintain dignity in circumstances that offered precious little of it. Whether Apollonia was a victim or a survivor, exploited or empowered, depends entirely on which lens you use to examine her life. The papyrus breaks off before we learn how her case was resolved, which seems appropriate. We don't know if Apollonia won her legal battle, if she successfully transitioned to a new life, or if she became another casualty of historical transformation. But we know she fought for her right to define her own existence, which makes her both utterly Roman and thoroughly modern. How this connects to everything we've discussed should be clear. From the earliest Roman legal codes through the Christian transformation and to modern debates about sex work, the same fundamental questions persist. Who gets to decide what constitutes exploitation? How do societies balance individual autonomy with collective values? Can personal choice ever be truly free in conditions of economic inequality? The memorable final image from Apollonia's story isn't dramatic or romantic. It's simply a woman standing in a courthouse, arguing for her right to control her own life. That image connects directly to contemporary sex workers fighting for legal recognition, to historical figures like Theodora transforming their experiences into political power, to every person who has ever tried to maintain dignity while society debated their moral worth. And so we reach the end of our journey through the secret life of Roman brothel workers. Though in many ways, the story continues. The questions Romans grappled with echo through history into our own time, reminding us that human societies have always struggled with the same fundamental challenges: how to balance competing values, how to protect vulnerable people, how to create systems that serve human flourishing rather than merely human appetites. The Romans we've encountered, from anonymous sex workers in Pompeii's Lupernaria to empresses reshaping imperial law, faced impossible choices with courage, creativity, and stubborn determination to survive. Their stories don't provide easy answers, but they offer something more valuable: the recognition that ordinary people have always found ways to maintain dignity and forge meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances. Perhaps that's the most real secret we've uncovered. Not the mechanics of ancient sexual commerce, but the timeless human capacity to adapt, endure, and occasionally transcend the limitations that history imposes on individual lives. Thank you for taking this journey through the shadows of ancient Rome. The past, as always, remains our most honest mirror. The daily rhythm of Roman brothel life followed patterns that would surprise modern observers with their mundane regularity. If you thought ancient sexual commerce was all passion and drama, think again. Most days involved the same repetitive tasks that define any service industry: cleaning, maintenance, customer management, and endless negotiation over prices and services. Morning routines in Roman brothels began before dawn. Much like any other business establishment, workers cleaned their small rooms, arranged personal belongings, and prepared for the day ahead. Let's be honest, the reality was far more domestic than erotic. Women mended clothing, applied makeup using mirrors of polished bronze, and gossiped about customers, money troubles, and dreams of different lives. The breakfast hour brought the first customers of the day, typically working men grabbing quick encounters before heading to their jobs. These early transactions were usually brief and businesslike, more about physical release than social interaction. Prices were lower in the morning, reflecting both the rushed nature of the encounters and the workers' need to generate steady income throughout the day. Meanwhile, brothel management handled the business side of operations. Owners or their representatives collected fees, managed supplies, dealt with local authorities, and resolved disputes between workers and customers. The administrative aspects of sexual commerce required the same attention to detail as any other Roman enterprise: record keeping, tax calculations, inventory management, and staff supervision. Afternoon hours brought a different clientele and atmosphere. Wealthier customers arrived with time for conversation, wine, and more elaborate encounters. Workers who had developed regular relationships with specific clients often reserved afternoon slots for these more profitable arrangements. The social dynamics during these peak hours resembled those of any hospitality business: skilled service providers managing multiple relationships while maximizing their earning potential. Evening activities in Roman brothels often extended beyond sexual services into entertainment and social interaction. Many establishments provided spaces for drinking, gambling, and conversation. Workers with musical or performance skills supplemented their income by entertaining customers in communal areas. These evening gatherings created a sense of community that helped workers cope with the emotional challenges of their profession. And yet, the daily routine was punctuated by constant reminders of social vulnerability. Local authorities conducted periodic inspections. Customers sometimes became violent or refused payment. Health problems threatened earning capacity. Family members might appear unexpectedly, creating emotional complications that few other professions generated. The rhythm varied by season and festival calendar. Religious holidays brought both opportunities and challenges. Increased customer traffic during celebrations, but also periods when certain activities were prohibited or restricted. Roman festivals often included sexual elements that increased demand for professional services, but also attracted unwanted attention from moral reformers. Still, most workers developed strategies for managing the psychological demands of their daily routine. Friendships with colleagues provided emotional support and practical assistance. Some created elaborate fantasy personas that allowed them to maintain psychological distance from their work. Others focused intensely on financial goals, treating each encounter as a step toward eventual freedom or security. To be fair, the daily life of Roman brothel workers included moments of genuine pleasure, friendship, and satisfaction. Women developed skills in conversation, performance, and human psychology that served them well both professionally and personally. The cosmopolitan environment of Roman cities meant that brothel workers often encountered people from diverse backgrounds, learning languages, customs, and perspectives that broadened their understanding of the world. The mundane reality was that most days passed without drama or crisis, just ordinary people doing difficult work in challenging circumstances, finding ways to maintain dignity and hope while serving the sexual needs of Roman society. The social networks surrounding Roman brothel workers created complex webs of relationships that extended far beyond the boundaries of sexual commerce. These networks provided everything from emotional support to economic opportunities, creating unofficial social safety nets in a world that offered few formal protections for vulnerable populations. Relationships between workers themselves formed the foundation of brothel social dynamics. Women shared information about difficult customers, pooled resources during illness or financial emergencies, and provided companionship that helped counter the isolation their profession often created. These bonds transcended ethnic and class divisions. A freeborn Roman woman fallen on hard times might find her closest friend was a Greek slave or Germanic freedwoman. Let's be clear, these relationships weren't always harmonious. Competition for the most desirable customers created tensions, and personality conflicts in confined spaces could become intense. Some workers formed exclusive cliques based on ethnicity or social background, while others remained isolated by choice or circumstance. But the overall pattern favored cooperation over competition, since collective action provided better protection against exploitation and abuse. The relationships with customers varied enormously in nature and duration. Some encounters were purely transactional, brief, anonymous, and immediately forgotten by both parties. Others developed into ongoing arrangements that resembled informal marriage relationships, with customers providing financial support in exchange for exclusive access and emotional intimacy. A few evolved into genuine romantic relationships that transcended their commercial origins. Meanwhile, connections with brothel owners and managers created another layer of social complexity. The best owners functioned as protectors and advocates, using their legal status and social connections to shield workers from abuse and official harassment. The worst were exploiters who maximized profits while minimizing worker welfare. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, creating relationships characterized by mutual dependence rather than pure exploitation or protection. Relationships with family members presented unique challenges for Roman brothel workers. Some maintained close ties with parents, siblings, and children despite social stigma. Others found their families rejecting them entirely once they entered sexual commerce. Many experienced complicated situations where family members both disapproved of their work and depended on their financial contributions. Sound familiar? These relationship patterns mirror those of modern sex workers, suggesting that the social dynamics of sexual commerce remain remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The need for peer support, the complexity of customer relationships, the importance of protective management, and the challenges of family acceptance appear in every society that includes organized sexual commerce. The broader social networks included connections with other marginalized populations, actors, gladiators, tavern keepers, and various types of entertainers. These groups often lived in the same neighborhoods, frequented the same establishments, and faced similar forms of social exclusion. Together, they created alternative communities with their own values, traditions, and support systems. Religious Networks also played important roles, though often in unexpected ways. Some workers maintained devotion to traditional Roman deities, particularly Venus and other goddesses associated with sexuality and fertility. Others were drawn to mystery, religions that promised spiritual transformation and community acceptance. As Christianity spread, some brothel workers became early converts, finding in the new faith both personal meaning and practical support for leading sexual commerce. And yet, perhaps the most important relationships were those that provided pathways out of prostitution, connections with potential marriage partners, business opportunities, or patron-client arrangements that offered alternative sources of income and social protection. Roman brothel workers developed rich forms of cultural expression that allowed them to maintain individual identity and collective solidarity despite their marginalized social position. These expressions ranged from personal adornment and performance styles to shared languages and ritual practices that created distinct cultural communities within the broader Roman world. Personal style and appearance functioned as both professional tools and identity markers. Workers invested significant portions of their earnings in clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, and hairstyles that projected specific personas to customers while expressing individual taste and cultural background. A woman from Gaul might maintain Celtic jewelry alongside Roman fashion, while an Egyptian worker could incorporate traditional eye makeup with contemporary Roman styles.